Christian Parenting. You're listening to the All Mom Does podcast, where you'll find encouragement, information, and inspiration for the life you're living, the kids you're raising, the romance you're loving, and the faith you're growing. I'm your host, Julie Lyles Carr. Let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the All Mom Does podcast, I have the distinct privilege of introducing you to a friend, and we're peers, but she's also kind of a mentor of mine. If you can have peer-to-peer mentoring, I would definitely say that's what's going on. Stephanie Harrison has had quite the varied life. She's lived a bunch of different places. She has 4 kids who are now all grown, and her wisdom in the way that she and her husband developed family culture, how they're continuing that going forward, you are definitely going to want to hear this. Those of us who are in the throes of building families, trying to maintain those connections. Stephanie, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Julie. I hope I can give you some do's and don'ts, maybe, from how we did it.
You know, sometimes talking about our mothering journeys is a place of, wow, here's how we did it. And sometimes it's just a cautionary tale, Stephanie. That's what we have the best to offer. Stephanie and I, our paths have crossed in multiple ways through the years. Our brothers are very dear friends in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And Stephanie and I, for a period of time, lived in the same city. And it's just amazing all the connections that we've had. You know, Stephanie, one of the things that I've always noticed about you from the very first few meetings that we ever had when we got to meet up is what an intentionality you and your husband, Alan, have put together when it comes to your family. Was that something that you, when you began a journey of having a family with your husband, was that something that you really felt like you had a pretty good grip on? Was it something you kind of felt your way through? And how did family background tie into that?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's probably some of both. My parents, the family I grew up in, were very intentional about a lot of things. They raised us very differently than they had been raised. I like to say, in some respects, they changed their stars. Both my mom and dad are very different than their siblings and very different than the homes that they were raised in. Good homes, but just very different. And they purposed early on to learn more and to be better. And so I was aware of that as a child, that they were doing it differently on purpose. And so I think when I was becoming a mom, I had the same intentionality that I will do this even better. And the truth is, Julie, I hope that all 4 of our children do it even better. I want them to be purposeful. That said, there are just so many things that, you think I got this covered, and I got this covered. And then guess what? That wasn't enough. There were a whole lot of things that needed to be covered or we needed to be intentional about. And I think for Alan and I, really coming to the marriage we both came from very strong Christian homes. We both had a desire to have Christ be center in our home, in our marriage, but also in how we raised our children. And so that was an easy sort of starting point, a common ground, if you will. And then between the two of us, I think I'm just more wired to be purposeful, intentional. I think things out to sort of their extreme end, and he's better at living in the moment, and I'm more like, but if we do this, that might happen. And he's been an amazing dad to our kids, and I think in God's wisdom, a good counterbalance to me, and I hope vice versa, that I've been a good counterbalance to him. And I don't know for his family, how he grew up, how purposeful his folks were, but his parents grew up in the church, but would tell you that they did not come to know Christ until they were adults. And Alan was a tag along. He was a surprise. So his brother and sister are 10 and 11 years older than he is, and then he came along. So he kind of almost grew up in a separate family from his siblings, and he got different parents from his siblings. And I think in a lot of ways, it worked out really well for Alan, and was a good thing. His brother and sister became followers of Christ kind of the same time as their parents did, which I think was probably around early teen years for them. And then Alan was 6, and sort of this big family change where they went from being church attenders to followers of Christ.
Right, right. You know, I think that that generational piece is so interesting because I have people in my world who they themselves were raised within the context of a Christian home. And they then I also have friends who were not. And Stephanie, what's becoming interesting to me is I see parents who are trying to provide a Christian home and they see their kids going adrift and they're really beating themselves up, even though they feel like they've tried to raise them in a Christian home. Then I have people who were not raised in a Christian construct and really go seeking for a spiritual platform upon which to build their lives. So, my question to you is how do we view raising our kids in a Christian home with the purest of motive and not a sense that it's going to completely seal the deal? Because the reality is our kids have to walk into their own faith journey at some point. And for a lot of us, myself included, there were things that I thought if I just purchased enough of the Christian, kid entertainment videos, and if I only had this kind of music playing, and if we did all these different rhythms throughout the day, that would ensure that my kids would walk in a certain way, with a certain intensity, with a certain devotion. And yet, we know that while those things can be important, they aren't the guarantee. So,
Right.
from the background that you come from, and then in the parenting that you've tried to instill, how have you created a balance, if you will, of really doing what you can to instill faith and yet at the same time allow your kids, particularly as your kids, all four of your kids now are into adulthood, at some point it's got to become their story, not ours.
That's a really good question. It's something I did think about. I think Scripture gives us a couple of examples of exactly what you're talking about. Sort of these great men of faith whose children are complete disasters. Eli in Scripture. I mean,
Yeah.
you start thinking about people. You've got a high priest, and then his sons go completely off the rails. And I knew I didn't want that. And I knew in my own experience that there was a transition from this is what my parents believe to this is what I believe. And a lot of that happened around puberty and going on youth group trips at my church. We belonged to a church that had a huge youth program, and my parents changed churches when I was in sixth grade, which at that point in my life was, in fact, the most traumatic thing of my entire life.
Hmm.
And we visited churches all summer, and I just wanted to die. I hated it. And the church that I chose was not the one that my parents chose, but the one that they chose for our family was a big part of why they chose it was because they did have such a large active youth program. I think it was brilliant. We were at church Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night when previously we'd only gone Sunday morning. So that was a big shock. But these were my friends. The church was across town. So it was an effort to get there. It was purposeful. We did it. But I went on missions trips in seventh grade, and we went to the Navajo reservation. We had to qualify to go. We had to study their culture. We had to be approved to go. It was a big process. And in the course of sort of going through those things, I began to separate what my faith was from my parents' faith, and that it wasn't just what they were teaching and talking about, it was God talking to me. And then the actual experience of those trips for me was amazing. I've heard what I would say is the voice of God a couple of times in my life. The first time I was middle of the Navajo Nation in Monument Valley, camping under the stars. Those were real moments that I can go back on. They're my stack of stones. Look what God did. And I have that. And so that was very real to me. And I recognized that I wanted to cultivate those experiences for my own children, that I would teach them and I would model for them and we would set examples, but I wanted them to develop their own faith. And I wanted them to question. Alan talks about a time in his life where he really questioned his faith, and he's incredibly intellectual. And when we saw with some of our kids a questioning, we didn't run from it. We talked it through. We walked it through. But we had done some purposeful things too. When each of our kids asked Jesus to be in their hearts, I wrote that date down. Man, Julie, we went back to that date and went, oh wait, no, it's written right
Yeah,
here.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, you did that. And we wanted to have sort of those, again, those stones, those reminders, those visual reminders in our children's lives that maybe we helped them set up. And, when something happened that was significant, we made record of it so that they could go back and look at those. And when they questioned, when they doubted, Isabella, our third, it has always been this interesting mix of extreme contrasts. And she has been a missionary in Ireland. She loves the Lord. She writes the most amazing things about God. She has such a deep, abiding faith with him. And I remember when she was maybe 4 years old, her looking at me and saying, "Mom, I don't get the Trinity." And I'm like, "Oh, yeah, girlfriend, me neither." But here I go.
Yeah.
I don't really know how to explain it to an adult, and I'm going to try to do it for a 4-year-old. But we weren't afraid of those
Mhm.
questions. And I never wanted my children to feel like they couldn't ask or they couldn't think it. I really wanted, if they thought it, for them to talk about it with me and for us to go there.
I love that you retained an open heart for the questions. And I think this is one of the places that a lot of parents can really struggle because it feels, in some ways, if you feel like you're laying it out and you're doing all the things you know to do, and then your kids come back and they will come back with questions that you may have never thought of. You feel
Right.
really ill-equipped to deal with. You feel like I don't know how to answer that. And we extrapolate when those things happen. Well, if I don't answer this correctly and I don't answer it immediately and we don't resolve this in this moment, then what does this mean about my child and their faith and their salvation and all the things? And so that willingness to not be threatened by questions, but to allow them. And I think sometimes, Stephanie, to allow the question to remain for a while. Not everything gets
Oh,
resolved in
yeah.
one discussion, not everything gets resolved in one take. So the willingness to leave the door open when those faith questions come, I think is really important for parents to hear you today, that the questions are part of the journey. The questions are part of the role of the mentor, of the parent to navigate through and to be honest about, I don't really know. That's really interesting. Or that's something I haven't been able to resolve for myself. I don't have a fast answer for that. Stephanie, one of the things that I have loved in watching your family through the years is you developed very early on this deep sense of family, deep sense of connectedness. And yet, in knowing all four of your adult kids, they're all very independent. They love you and Alan dearly, but they have not at all hesitated to go on all kinds of adventures. You've got one who lives in DC, but she works in San Francisco. You've got one in Tennessee with your twin grandbabies. You've got one in Colorado in the Denver area. And then where's your youngest now? Is he also still in Colorado?
He is staying in Denver. Yeah. So for the first time in a long time, I'm going to have two permanently in the same city. Not the
Right.
city I'm in, but
Right. Important distinction because you're down here in Texas, a little ways down the road from me in San Antonio. And so I have loved seeing the independence that your kids have and yet the connection. What are the things that you did early on to foster those two things? Because you and I both know families where people are very enmeshed with each other. It's lovely, but there's not much of a sense of being able to chart your own course or to be really independent. On the other hand, we know families that, that short season that kids are in your homes and then everybody scatters and there doesn't seem to be much of a bond that remains. So, how did you navigate these two things that can seem kind of different, which is keeping a family really connected and yet at the same time making sure you were nurturing your kids toward independence?
I think it was a combination of being purposeful about some things and God's grace on a whole lot of other things. For us, we really emphasized family. So we were not a family that did big friend birthday parties, for instance. We did family birthday parties, and whatever city we were living in, if we had extended family there, they came. But they were family birthday parties. That was who was invited, and then we did do some, in case you're feeling sorry for our children, sort of big birthday parties where they did the big friend thing, right? But I talked a lot with our children growing up that you will always be friends with your siblings. Your best friend today, you may not remember their name when you see their picture when you're an adult. And they just looked at me like I had three heads, that couldn't be possible because, they can't possibly get enough time with this person. And we encouraged friendships. And don't want it to sound like we didn't, but we didn't encourage friendships above family relationships. And I talked about when they would have issues with one another, that you're blessed. You have siblings and you get real world experience in working out problems. And you will work them out. That's not an option not to, which I think sometimes out in the world, you can just quit associating with somebody. And so I think that our kids worked a lot of things out together. They were homeschooled through 7th grade for the girls, and the girls went to school in 8th grade, and then through 6th grade for Isaiah, because that was when we moved to Austin, and so we did it a little differently for him. But, that creates a tightness that I'm sure you understand.
Right.
That's a little unique. It's different. You're in the classroom, you're studying, you're doing chores, your schedule's a little different, but you got a whole lot of together that not everybody necessarily gets. And that was a path that we chose for our family and was a huge blessing. And I think really strengthened our ties to one another. It made me really close to our children and to really knowing them and understanding them. So a huge blessing that I hadn't really anticipated coming out of the decision to homeschool. I think that moving, which just FYI, not on my radar. The last house we built in Colorado, which was 4 houses ago, I thought I would welcome grandchildren to. I haven't lived in that house for over 10 years now. So, surprise, God, decided to move us. And boy, that was hard. And our move to Texas, I always joke that you can still see my fingernail marks in the pavement, dragging me from Colorado to Texas. We moved in the middle of a drought to Austin. We moved into an apartment in North Austin. Our kids were going to school in South Austin. I was on the road in traffic. It was a terrible time. Isaiah was so angry and mad. But you know what? We stuck it out as a family. Our second daughter had just started college, so our younger two were the ones who made the move with us. The younger two dubbed us the Core Four, and that's our text messaging group. If it's just the 4 of us talking, it's called the Core Four, and we went through some tough times together. A lot of crying, a lot of wondering if God was in fact punishing us. We had to walk 5 minutes to get our dog to a green spot of grass to do his business. And we moved from Colorado, and this was not what we thought we were getting. It was 114 every day, and then Bastrop caught on fire. So we really did sort of feel like God had moved us to hell. I'm sorry, Austin, we love you. But it was that hard time that really forged some tight bonds and in a unique way with our younger 2 children that we didn't necessarily have with our older 2. So that to me is sort of one of those not planned. I wasn't purposefully saying, hey, let's move somewhere no one wants to go and see what that does for our family. But that's what God used. And, God totally redeemed what was a very difficult situation for all of us. Our older 2, we moved to Tulsa, moved before Isaiah was born. Isaiah was actually born in Tulsa. That was an incredibly difficult time for me. I felt like I was trading my family for my husband's family, and that didn't seem like a fair trade, even though they're wonderful, wonderful people. They just weren't my family. And I really believe God took my tears away for a year. And I think that if I had started crying, I wouldn't have stopped. And God had to do a work in me. And I will never forget, we were actually just in Tulsa. My mother-in-law just passed away, and we were there for the service, and we were driving, and I said, this is where it happened. And all my kids said, what? And I said, I was driving, and you 3 girls were behind me, and I was crying. And I thought you couldn't see me. This was before we moved, but we knew we were moving. And Ariel, who at the time would have been 3, said, don't cry, Mommy. I'll pray for you. Well, of course, then I just sobbed harder. But, they walked through that in a different way with me, which I think also created some bonds of togetherness and, your best friends with the guy in the foxhole or whatever. There was some of that happened. Some moves that I didn't want, that I hadn't anticipated, that we hadn't really planned for, but knew clearly God was moving us. God used those to really bind our family together and to make us more of a cohesive unit. And the truth is, Julie, we love spending time together. My adult kids, they're so much fun. I mean, they're just delightful to me. And so we love being with them. They love being with each other. They love being with us. But the other half of your question was, how did you foster that independence? And that was really important to me. And I didn't realize it until we moved. Our moving away from Denver was really hard on my parents, but especially on my mom. And she took it personally. And I think part of why she took it personally was she and my dad had left Nebraska on purpose. They wanted to leave that and forge a new path. And she didn't really understand that we weren't wanting to leave, but we were following God's call and God's direction. And we'd prayed and then prayed more about whether or not we were doing it. But it illustrated to me that I didn't want to ever make my children feel like I disapproved of them following God's will for their life. And I don't think my mom knows that she did that. I mean, her intention would never, ever in a million years have been to do that. But that was sort of the end result. So I worked really hard in letting my kids know I 100% would love to live near you, but 1,000% I want you to listen to God's voice. And I tell all of them all the time, I'm so proud of you. I really believe you're following God's will for your life. When they change jobs, when they change cities, when they change whatever, they call us and they ask us to pray. And they pray about it. They ask for wisdom and direction. They ask for input. They ask for advice. And we give them all of those things. And then we always say, we know that you have a tremendous relationship with the Lord, and we trust that He will tell you what it is you're supposed to do, and know that we will support that. And so I have given them that freedom, and there have been times I've thought, wow, that was stupid. When I had 4 children in 4 different time zones at one point, none of them were my time zone. I didn't really enjoy that. But I will say that is what God has called me to do, is to raise them, as you said, to launch. I've always had the mindset that I was raising an adult, and I've raised 4 adults, and that may mean they don't live anywhere near me. But what I want is that they are living the life that God has for them. And then I just trust God to sort out the rest, which means I'm on an airplane a lot.
Yeah, I was going to say, you travel a lot. I love seeing how you are still conducting family ties at the level that you are, because that's one thing that in fostering independence for our kids, that I think today, in some ways, is a little easier on a mama's heart than might have been in some previous generations. When I think about, Laura Ingalls' family, if you will, from Little House on the Prairie, leaving Wisconsin, leaving all the family, heading to Kansas, and there was no FaceTime. There was no, well, Grandma and Grandpa will come out on the next flight and help you guys get moved in. There was none of that. Whereas today, I do think, as difficult as it can be sometimes to tell our kids, go, fly, live, particularly when that means they're not going to be in our locale. However, I am so grateful for the tools that we do have to continue to allow family to remain connected. We don't have to be as disconnected as families in the past if we want to stay connected. It was I reached out to you a few weeks ago because I was laughing at myself. We've had 3 weddings of car kids in 14 months. And Stephanie, I would have told you, it's a lot. It was a lot. The mama's tired. The mama has, hot glue gun scars for days from all of the things that had to be done for these
wedding crafts.
Oh yeah, wedding crafts are a whole other conversation. Even if you say, "Oh, I'm not crafty," well, you will be a little bit during some of these weddings. But I had felt really good that I had been releasing kids so easily. So my son Justice got married, and he and his wife Lily live here in Austin. My daughter McKenna and her husband Yutaka live just right down the road from you in San Antonio. And then I married my 3rd one just a few weeks ago, and she got married, got in a car, and left with her husband, who's a Marine, to go back out to Camp Pendleton. And all of a sudden, I thought, oh, all the things I've been so congratulatory when it comes to, oh, yes, I launched my kids. I don't cry. When they go to college, when they get married, I'm fine. I'm totally fine. I realized Mama was not fine, Stephanie. Mama was not fine by a long shot. And I reached out to you and I said, okay, talk me through this. I know you have kids all over the place. So, what have y'all done in terms of travel, in terms of communication? Because here's the rub for a lot of us in wanting our kids to be independent. In some ways, it can be easy to retreat too far. At the same time,
Mm-hmm.
we know there's a lot of tendency to continue that helicopter parent temptation, which is to be calling them constantly, to be having expectations about how much they should be coming to us and exactly what the holiday should look like and all of that. So how have you navigated the bonuses of technology and travel that get you where you need to be so you can be with them and yet at the same time still leave enough margin that they're living their lives?
Mm-hmm. I think that's still evolving, honestly. Our older two are married. Like you said, Alexandra lives in DC but works in San Francisco. She and her husband actually are in San Francisco this week. He's taking a little time off they're both attorneys, and he's taking a little time off before he starts his new job as a Supreme Court clerk, which
That's
is
awesome.
just huge. And we're so proud of him. Do you see how I worked that in
Yeah.
there? But it is constantly evolving as a child gets married. You want to give them space, but you still want to be involved. And I'm so grateful for all the technology we have. So on any given day, we have a Harrison William and text. So I don't know, starting at 6:30 this morning, that was blowing up. And so it's my three daughters and I, and everything gets covered in that. There's the family group text, and that gets used less because the men are a little cranky about getting a lot of texts in the middle of their day, whatever. There are Marco Polo, the app. I don't know if you're familiar with that one. When I became a grandma, that app became my best friend because I get to see those babies when it works for Ariel. She'll send me a quick Marco, and I get to see those babies, and then I get to watch it when it works for me. I mean, oh my gosh, who would have thought of that? What a blessing! And I kept saying to her when she was telling me about it, well, how's that different than you just sending me a video? And she just rolled her eyes and was like, "Download it,
Yeah.
Mom.
Yeah.
Just
Just do it.
download
Just
it."
do
And
it.
it's been fantastic, a great way of communicating. But, each of our kids has kind of forged what works for them in terms of communication. Isabella is our big communicator. She has sent a nightly email. Every night when Alexandra, the oldest, went to college, Isabella started emailing her every night, unbeknownst to any of us. When Ariel went away to college, she got included on the nightly email. Well, then when I went on a trip to see one of them and I wasn't by Isabella, I got included on the nightly email. And she has just kept it up for
I
more
was
than
gonna
10
say it's
years
been a
now.
yeah.
Every night she sends an email. First thing I look for when I open my phone up is her email. And sometimes it's not there. And I'm like, are you okay? Sent, because thankfully she always has been. But, that's kind of a lot of communication compared to some of my other kids, but I love it. And I respond to her. So we communicate a little bit, sometimes her email's long, sometimes it's one sentence with lots of typos as she's falling asleep, but it works. Like I said, Ariel uses Marco a lot, and she and her husband and their kids usually FaceTime with Alan and I both on Sunday afternoon, which is a treat for Alan because he doesn't get as much of that. Isaiah, from the time he went away to college, he calls us 2 o'clock Sunday afternoon. And he FaceTimes us, which I was surprised at. I thought he would just call, but he wants to FaceTime. And you know what, Julie? What a
Yeah.
blessing. I get to put my eyes on him and see him. And that's just good for this mama's heart. And for Alexandra, who has truly the crazy schedule with her husband of really any human I know, she calls at different times, and sometimes it's FaceTime. Mostly it's a phone call here, phone call there, text. Occasionally she emails, but we talk at least once a week. It's just not always, on a schedule. And I'm good with all of that. That works for me. You asked about, going to see them. That's really a priority, being able to see my kids. And I'm blessed that I have that flexibility, but I have given up some other things that would prevent me from having that flexibility and other good things. But I've just decided I've seen raising children goes by so fast. And this stage is going to change too when I only have 2 grandchildren. When, there's just one of me and one of Alan, and getting to everybody, and it's going to get spread thinner and thinner. And so I don't want to not do something now because of X, Y, or Z. It's just important to me. And so, my credit card earns me miles. And I am very diligent and very good about earning miles and flying for free. And, our second daughter, who's the mother of our twin grandbabies, they live in Knoxville, Tennessee. It's not an easy place to get to from San Antonio, Texas. I can't fly direct, and I've spent a lot of time in airports on layovers with delays. And you know what? I don't remember that. I remember that time I spent on the floor with those grandbabies, though. And, the first time they call me by name, or when they light up when they see me, or, any of those things. And so that's just it's been a priority. And it's not just with the grandkids. I love spending time with our kids. With Alexandra, who worked in the Department of the Treasury, we made sure we went out and we got a tour of the Department of the Treasury, and we got all the behind the scenes stuff. And oh my gosh, it was so cool. And I want to see where my kids work, and I want to see where my kids live. And that's important. And so, when Ellen gets time off, and we plan trips really to see the kids. Now, we like to travel just the two of us too, which this last year has washed. But it really is, it's important to both of us. So actually that's where we're going Friday, is to see the two younger ones in Denver. And that's nice. We get to see two at once.
You finally get to double up. It is really fascinating, because I think for a lot of us as women, we sometimes think about when we get the kids launched that this will be our season. And, that thing that we've been putting off, or that career path that maybe we put on hold a little bit, that's when we're going to chase it. And I had that revelation a couple of years ago that, okay, wait a minute. Some of the things that I've been investing in are actually going to prove to be kind of limiting when it comes to my schedule, when it comes to my time. And as it turns out, I really still want to be with these kids. I'm not saying that's how it's going to be for everyone. I think there are people that the way they choose to launch and the way that all that goes down, or maybe their kids live really close and in the same town, which that gives you a different level of freedom if that's the situation. But I've had that same kind of aha moment of, you know what? There's some really cool and great things that are on the table, but those are not the things when it comes to continuing to invest in my kids' lives. It's not going to allow me that kind of flexibility that I need. So it is interesting to change the lens a little bit, to think about, okay, wait, how do we build lifestyles, if you will, that allow us to continue to make family a priority when the dynamics of how we celebrate family are different. Stephanie, I know from the listeners we have, from the people that respond to different episodes, there are those mamas out there who are listening to this and who are thinking, well, that's all amazing and great, but I have a kid who has questioned their faith to the point that they're not following God. I have a kid that through a series of situations is estranged from the family. I have a child who never got along with their siblings, didn't want that kind of friendship. And now that they are launching into adulthood, those bonds are not there. What do you say to a mom who's in that situation?
Boy, that's just hard. The first thing I would say, though, is mom guilt is never productive. As much as you can let go of whatever it is you're beating yourself up for. Let it go. I mean, I can tune into your podcast, Julie, and hear from half a dozen women who did everything better than I did. And I can just beat myself up for that. Or I can say, nope, this was my path, and this is what I did, and this is where I am. And if you're looking at something that you've done that you recognize maybe you did it wrong, then change going forward. But the biggest thing for me is releasing our children to God. And if you're a mama of a little, you need to release that child to God. And if you're the mama of an adult, you need to release that child to God. And, we talked about this earlier, that the child has to make the decision for themselves to follow Christ. The child has to make the decision for themselves to live in God's will. And you can be a perfect mama, and they can still choose not to do that. And you know what? That's free will. And that is their choice. But we've got knees that we can kneel on and we can pray. And for years I heard about women in my stage of life who couldn't sleep at night, and
Here we
lo and
are.
behold,
Yeah.
there it is. But quite a few years ago, I recognized that if I was awake in the middle of the night, that was really a great time for me to just talk to God. And there's just been a lot of talking to God about my kids in the middle of the night for a lot of years. And for a long time, if there was something that was going on in one of my children's lives, God woke me up in the middle of the night. I mean, I woke up and I knew, this kid, pray now. And I even had a conversation with one of them, and I said, so God woke me up at 3 last night to pray for you. What's going on?
Yeah.
Big eyes,
Yeah.
alarm, and then confession. And, the truth is that didn't happen all the time, but it did that one time. And I think that, as much as we love our children, God loves them more. And we have to turn them over to Him. And we have to know that their story's not done being written. Years and years and years ago, I heard Margaret Feinberg speak in person. And I'll never forget something she said. She said, there is nothing too difficult for God to redeem. And, I bet that was 15, 20 years ago, I heard her say that. And I have seen that happen over and over again. Something that seemed hopeless, a situation, a person who had gone astray, a circumstance that there was just no hope. And yet God redeemed it. And that story wasn't over. It takes time, and it takes patience, and it takes reminding ourselves that God is a good God. And it takes letting go and turning them over to God, sometimes daily. I mean, we want to pull things back. We do. We want to reel it in. We want to say, oh, it was easier when they were 2 or whatever. But you know what? They've got to live their life. They've got to establish their relationship with the Lord. They've got to make their decisions. We're not responsible for them. And we can pray. And that's a powerful, powerful tool. And, for a child that's estranged from the family, I had a dear friend from college who had a son who became estranged from them, and it was just through divorce and lots of difficult circumstances, and he ended up having a child out of wedlock, and just sort of all the things that this friend of mine, hadn't stood for. I mean, she hadn't anticipated herself getting divorced, but then, just really lost communication with this boy. And she ended up going to counseling, and it was just so good and so beautiful. And they have such a beautifully restored relationship. But I bet it took 12 years. But you know what? That boy has 3 children now, not just one, and she's grandma to them, and they adore her, and she adores them. But this from a child that wouldn't speak to her. And I would just say there's hope. But she spent a lot of time on her knees and did a lot of things, shut her mouth a lot, didn't see him when she wanted to, kind of played by his terms and by his rules. And, God has redeemed that, and I think continues to redeem that situation. I don't have a hard, fast suggestion or, tip, but I do believe that God wants to restore relationships, and those starting with the relationship with Him, and then family relationships. And sometimes we have to let go of those kids when they walk away like that. Our only lifeline to them is through prayer, and it's a powerful one, but it's hard as moms when we've carried them and fed them and kept them alive for 18 years to go, okay, I guess you get to make your own decisions now.
Yeah. But very powerful often to see that when a child realizes that you're still there for them in prayer, but you're not trying to control everything, you're not trying to hover.
Mm-hmm.
It is amazing what can happen. And of course, very biblical when we look at the story of the prodigal, like, okay, go, fly, do your thing. I'm here when you're ready. Really is a powerful posture to be in. Well, Stephanie, I can't thank you enough for being here. I know that this is going to be one of those episodes that listeners go back and listen to again, gleaning all the good from it. Thanks so much for being willing to be on. And I hope you have a great time seeing your youngest 2. I'm going to be continuing to follow your adventures and keep up with you, because I know that it really helps me sort through what this next season of mothering is supposed to look like. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Julie.
Check out the show notes for all the links, info, and other goodness from this week's episode, with a big thank you to our content coordinator, Rebecca. I've got a request. please go subscribe and like and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. It really does make a difference in helping other people find the show. And I'll see you next week here at the All Mom Does Podcast.